Deborah, how are you doing today? Thank you so much for being on the podcast with us. And, we think that this will be a really valuable information for other folks that are in the field of OD or in a similar role to Deborah. So we came up with a list of questions to ask her. And, most of us do have questions. We want to ask the people, that know the best how to handle different situations. OD can be very complex. So Deborah, thank you so much. Let's start off just by asking you a little bit about your background in organization development, some of your responsibilities, and how you got to where you are today.
Okay, well, my background is in engineering, so I started in technical engineering for a long time, and our plant site here in West Michigan decided to implement self-directed work teams, so I was a coach for a couple of years, full-time, working on implementation of those teams, and loved the work and loved what I was doing. And so after that project was completed, I actually was a supervisor on site for a little over a year, and then I left to raise our kids and got back into it when I took a job at a consulting firm, and they were a lean CI type of consulting firm. And so I got to work at multiple different companies in West Michigan, and just decided to come back to the company that I had been with and the plant that I had been with. And I just enjoy working in that type of an environment, like inside the company, as opposed to being outside in consulting. So I know there are people that enjoy being in the consulting role, and I enjoy the consulting role also, but I enjoy more being in the thick of things in the company itself. So I'm in training right now. I actually came back as a logistics supervisor. So I worked as a logistics supervisor for 3 years. And then now I have a job in training where I'm doing organization development, training, leadership development, vision, mission, strategy. So it's a fun mix of a little bit of everything. So
Definitely. And
yeah.
you recently completed the OD certified professional program,
I
correct?
did. I did. And I'll be honest, that's the first time that I heard the organization development word. I didn't know that what I liked and what I did had a name. So
Isn't that
so
amazing?
yeah, so that certification program introduced me to a whole new world. Edgar Schein, I'd never heard of him before. I don't know how I had never heard of him, but
Or Kurt
yeah,
Lewin.
oh yeah. And so
But
it was
Edward
yeah.
Deming is the one that introduced us to quality management, and he was actually an OD pioneer. So he
Oh,
borrowed from Kurt Lewin's work, and then
okay.
he introduced the quality management, lean and Six Sigma and things like that, quality circles in the 1980s. So I first got introduced to that at Uniroyal. I had to lead, and that's where I learned to be a facilitator, facilitating quality circle teams. So
Sure.
that a lot of us got started in the quality, in the field of quality. We didn't know it was OD. So isn't that
Mm-hmm.
amazing?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, thank you, Deborah, for sharing this.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we talked earlier, and I think you actually asked me when you were in the class about how do you deal with two colliding cultures, and that some of the work that some of the issues you've been dealing with are, in fact, the different cultures that you're working with. So would you like to tell us a little bit about how you handle that? How are you?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about where to begin.
Well, what
So
makes it, I guess what we thought about what makes it difficult to work in a in two colliding cultures.
probably the number one thing that I would say is differing expectations.
Hmm.
So the expectations that you have as a worker in one culture versus the expectations in a different culture, what you expect of management, what you expect of the system, what the workers are expecting of the system and of the culture and of leadership in particular. What is leadership's role? How do they what's the best way to put it? How do they implement their ideas, their values, the strategy? How do they communicate? So, when you go through that type of a culture shift from one organization to another, even when you keep the same people, just the expectations change and everybody's learning new behaviors. So you have people that are firmly in one camp, you have people that might be firmly in another camp, and then you've got a whole bunch of in between, that you're trying to work through. And especially if you are instituting change within that culture shift, you've got another set of change going on in the midst of this culture. It can be very challenging. It can be very, very challenging managing expectations and how am I supposed to behave? What am I supposed to do? What I did before in this old culture was very highly valued, and now in this new culture, maybe not so much. Okay, so am I important? Do I matter? Does my role matter? There's lots of things that play into that whole situation.
It really hits home to that to Kurt Lewin's iceberg theory. And everyone uses the iceberg model. They talk about it, but that was really Kurt Lewin that came up with it. And they talk about in most organizations, the culture's above the iceberg. And then then there's all the hidden behaviors and beliefs that are below the iceberg. And a lot of people are operating out of those things that are hidden and unknown. And, so that's what's really difficult when you have that type, I guess the higher the water line, in the iceberg, the less, more difficult it is for all those hidden behaviors. So that would be a really great thing to take a look at. But what have you done in your area to be able to deal with some of these kind of unsaid cultural norms that people have to, kind of deal with in the day-to-day? Is there anything that you've done that you could share with us?
Well, one of the things that we did is we measured it. So, and that was part of the OD class, was taking a look at it and saying, okay, can you measure a culture? And I found a great article in a Harvard Business Review book that I had on culture change, I think is the name of the book. And they had actually gone through and they had done a number of studies on culture and how you can determine what type of culture you're operating in. And so I used a lot of the information from that article and went through, created a survey, talked to most of our supervisors, actually all of our supervisors and managers on site to get a handle, and particularly those who had been part of the previous culture and who were part of the new culture now. Because some of the discontent that I was sensing, I thought was due to that culture change. And it ended up that, it's not a good or bad, because that's one thing people think of, is that they're like, well, this culture is good and this culture is bad. And you can have a toxic culture. There's no question about it. If you get into disrespect, if you get into bullying and things like that, I mean, you can definitely have a toxic type of culture. But in our particular instance, we had a culture that was way up in one quadrant, if you would, and then another culture that was almost polar opposite. Not that they were bad. Neither culture is bad. It's just that they emphasize very different things and very different behaviors. So we were able to take a look at it and say, oh, look at that. There really is a major change that occurred. Okay, so now this change occurred. How are we going to deal with it? And how are we going to take a look at it? How are we going to take a look at our systems, at our processes? How are we going to take maybe the benefits of this culture and the benefits of this culture and put them together into something new? And so that's what we're working on right now. Working with the leadership team. We used graphic facilitation from the Grove. So if anybody's heard of the Grove, they have a history map that's fantastic, that it brings everybody onto the same page. So everybody then creates a shared history. And you can say, okay, that was then, this is now. Now, where are we going to go to the future? And you're able to pull the strengths of everybody from both of those cultures together to then start to take a look towards a new future, together. So that went over actually very, very well. It was very effective. And people not only enjoyed it, but it it helped us to refocus as an organization on the future. So,
Excellent. Well,
yeah.
and how can you how can you help people overcome resistance? How have you done that in your organization? Because a lot of people don't like to give up what they loved doing before or what they felt was important. What are some examples of things that you've done to help people through that process?
Well, when it comes to resistance, part of it is you have to know why. Why is the resistance occurring? Is it something short term? Is it something long term? Is it a personal conflict, with somebody that you know? Is it just general resistance to change? I don't want to change. One thing that I did find in my research as I was going through this and trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to measure this? Was that the stronger the culture, the more difficult it is to change, which can create resistance to change as well. So it depends on what people are resisting. A lot of people were resisting just the change in general. For some people, there was probably a bit of a value clash. So this culture up here tended to do a better job of reinforcing certain values than this culture did. So, so taking a look at your personal values, taking a look at the organization as a whole and saying, okay, is it really that the organization's values and your values are really different? Or is it that the organization has a different way of expressing those same values? So, okay, so it's not a whole bunch of things, boiling it all down to saying,
That's really
you gotta listen. You have to go out and you have to put on your detective hat and find out, why are people resisting? Because if you don't know why, then you can spend a whole lot of time on money on something that doesn't matter.
Right. And you might not even know they're resisting because most people don't want to share, show their face if things are not comfortable because of the political environment. So they might just be hiding things.
Well, I wouldn't even say so much that, or they don't even know that they're resisting. They're trying to operate within the old culture, and the new culture isn't necessarily reinforcing those behaviors that the old culture did. And maybe it's not that those behaviors are necessarily bad, it's that the reinforcement has changed. So that can be really difficult. You went from an A team to maybe you're still A team, but you don't feel like you're A team because you're not getting reinforced like you used to be. So now I think I'm B or C or D team, which can impact, your contributions when in fact, none of that is necessarily true. It's just that the reinforcement is different. I've had to tell myself that,
Right.
so.
Yeah. How important is it for communication to take place between the team leader, the manager, supervisor, and the individual or the team?
Huge. And I think, if you go through, if you do any kind of leadership studying at all, you'll see that communication is one of the number one, I don't know, would you want to call it an attribute or a skill of a leader, to be able to communicate, to be, if you're a leader, you're out in front. So you need to be communicating where you're going, why you're going there. What are we going to do when we get there? What are we going to do when we're on our journey? So it's critical. And particularly when you're going through a change, and particularly for the reasons that we talked about, reinforcement of behaviors, reinforcement of performance expectations. If you're not communicating them, that's a problem. I think one of the things that we used a quote from Alice in Wonderland, which was essentially, if you don't know where you're going, then any path will get you there. And it's actually, I didn't know that it originated from Alice in Wonderland and the communication between Alice and the rabbit. And she's saying, where do I go? And he says, well, where do you want to go? And she goes, it doesn't really matter, anywhere. And he goes, well, then it doesn't really matter what path you take. And so just being able to articulate where you're going and why you're going there is huge. Absolutely huge. So
that's great. Great philosophy. Thank you for sharing that. I know
from Alice.
the time's going really fast, but there was a couple other questions that we wanted to ask you, and we wanted to talk about your role, and when we're facilitating as OD, professionals, what are some of the challenges that you've experienced, and how did you overcome them? I think that would be really meaningful for people to really understand more about that.
Well, one of the things probably is to know yourself so that when you go into a situation, you know what might be challenging to you and what might not, so that at least you have some things in mind on how to deal with them. So one of my particular challenges is when people are super negative, but they're just taking pot shots. They're not just, and maybe this is a lot of people just generally being negative in the group. You have a problem person, and you can have problem people from lots of different aspects. They talk too much, they don't talk at all. They seem to be totally disengaged. Particularly if you have a leader who's totally disengaged. So there's numbers of different challenges that you can have. My basic one though is that negativity. It's what do you do? And I had a person who came into a meeting. It was a very large meeting with a lot of management present, who he had actually created a list of 22 points of issues that he had. Not only but with me when I was a supervisor, but with the organization in general. And I had known ahead of time that he was going to come into with the list, and I had read some of the things on the list. But he's presenting the list, and there are people in the back of the room going like this. So you're kind of going, okay, I thought he had talked to everybody, but apparently he didn't. But anyway, I guess my basic point is that if somebody's going to be negative, you've got to hear them out to a certain extent, but you also need to focus them on, okay, specifically, what are the problems? And when you've got 22 things, specifically, what are the 2 or 3 in that list that we can talk about and work on? Because we don't have time in a meeting to address 22 points. And you don't necessarily want the negative person to control your meeting either. So, so for me, those are the types of situations that I find most challenging. And I'm sure that there are other people who have other types of situations that are challenging for them. And again, when it comes to negative people, just growing a thick skin, because a lot of times their issue isn't necessarily with you. It's frustration, it's with the system. So allowing people to be able to vent while at the same time redirecting them, refocusing, okay, what are we here for? What is it that we're trying to do? Where are we going? Which again goes back to the communication that we just talked about. If you don't know where you're going, it's really hard, because you can be negative about all kinds of things. And how do you turn that around? How do you take that negative energy and turn it into positive energy and positive change for the group? Can be difficult.
I think you're amazing. I'm really, I can't imagine how tough it might be as a facilitator in the field of OD, but just maybe kind of, what do you do for yourself to keep yourself mindful and mentally able to be able to deal with challenging situations? Or anything that you can share with us that you might do?
Uh, um, that's a good question. I read a lot. You need to take a break. So when something is tough and you're going around in a circle and you just can't seem to figure out what the issue is, go take a break. I'm fortunate. I live in West Michigan, an area where we can hike, we can go to the beach, we can do lots of things. But take a break, change what you're working on for a while and come back to it. I do spend a lot of time, especially if it's a problem that it's just churning, just lots of churn. I'll write things down. I'll just write down everything that I can think of, like any of my major concerns. And then again, take a break and come back to it and say, okay, here are the concerns. Are they legitimate? First of all. And then if they're legitimate, okay, how are you going to deal with it? Is it me? Is it somebody else? Do I need to get help? Am I the problem? Because I can certainly be the problem, and I have been several times. So, just being able to take a look at those problems and again, taking a break allows you to maybe be able to take a more outside looking approach to it. Maybe you're not
Yeah,
so emotionally attached to it.
right. That's
Um,
a good point. Don't
you
it,
know,
don't own their problem, right? But
mhm.
be there for them so they're able to work through it.
Yeah, and there's one thing, and you talked about it in the OD program as well. Are the consequences correct? You know,
Mm,
as people are starting to have issues, and again, you've got this whole culture thing going on, are the right consequences falling on the right people?
true.
So, you know, you can have a person who is legitimately negative because they are legitimately having a bad deal. There are other people who are negative where you're going, you know, grow up. But, um, but there are people out there where you know, you can take a look at it and you say, oh, okay, because of the way that the process is designed and the way that the process is going and the way that roles are being filled and the way people are working, you're right. I mean, you're getting the negative consequences for something that's not your fault
Yeah,
necessarily. How do we change that around? You know, how can we work through that? And sometimes naming it helps immensely, you know,
excellent. Yeah,
just helping that person to be able to say, yeah, okay, yeah, I think that is the root cause. Okay, that's 50% of the problem, 80% of the problem, depending on who you are. You know, how are we going to fix it? And how are we going to make sure it stays fixed?
such
So.
great advice, Deborah. It's really excellent because you're dealing with this every day. We really, really appreciate it. I'm sure there are other people listening that are going to be so appreciate what you've shared with them. Where else can we go but to the OD doctor to find out how to deal with different situations? So I'm so happy that you were able to share with us today and to be here. So thank you so much. And I hope this isn't the last time.
Well, thank you. You're welcome.
Welcome too. All right. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to say before we end for the day?
No, just hang in there. If you're a facilitator, if you're working in OD, you're there to help. And sometimes it can be painful, you know, have courage, have a thick
Yeah,
skin, um, you know, move forward, get your data. If you have your data and you know that there's an elephant in the room, you know, don't be afraid to, you know, work on the elephants.
yeah.
So,
Try to figure it out. Don't
mhm,
show your fear either. How about that?
mhm,
Because once you
mhm.
show that you're maybe disbelieving that you're doing the right thing, people might take advantage of that. So you gotta not show your fear that things aren't
Well,
working the way that you want it to work.
yeah, or refocus your fear into curiosity,
There
you
you
know.
go. That's a great one.
You know,
That's a really great
the
one.
big thing would be, okay, I've got this situation. And now, granted, I mean, there are times where the situation is like, "Ah, what am I going to do?" But you know, curious. Okay, I'm watching this behavior. Where is this coming from? You know,
Mhm.
where is this person really coming from? And sometimes they don't even know because they're so emotionally wrapped up in that thing. And that's part of where, you know, where we are as facilitators, that's our job, is to make it easy for that person, to make it easy. That's what facilitate means, is to make easy. And so if a person is really struggling and having a hard time, but they have something to contribute, make it easy for them. You know, figure out ways to be able to engage people in where you're going. And again, once again, you got to know where you're going. So,
Absolutely.
um,
Wow. Thank you so much, Deborah.
you're
Look forward to
welcome.
seeing you soon.
Thanks.